Hi, and welcome to YTV. Today we're going to talk about depression and self-esteem. And here's our host, Rege Taylor.
Thank you, Julie. Today we are talking about self-esteem and depression. Welcome to YTV. My guest today is Mr. Andrew Gillie. We're going to find out today what self-esteem, depression, all of that is. My guest is Andrew Gillie. Hi, Andrew. How you doing?
Hi.
First of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do is...
Okay. My name is Andrew Gillie. I work as a mental health therapist for Wesley Highland Services. It's a private school in Castle Shannon, PA. I work with kids who have had a lot of difficulties in their public schools and their families, and I have a chance to try and help the kids with some of the problems that they've had and hopefully get back to public schools.
All right, so what is self-esteem?
Well, the word self-esteem comes from the word esteem, of course, which means your opinion or your regard for someone, what kind of opinion you have of a person. So self-esteem basically is the opinion or the regard that you have for yourself, how you feel that you can deal with situations, what you think about your abilities, what you think about yourself as a person.
Then what is depression?
Depression basically is an illness. Self-esteem or a low self-esteem, not feeling good about yourself, not feeling you can handle things, is actually pretty common in teenagers. Depression, on the other hand, is a wider problem that self-esteem is a part of. Depression includes some things like having difficulty sleeping, having difficulty eating. When you think of someone who's depressed, you automatically think of someone who's sitting around moping all the time. And that's not necessarily true. The main thing to look for is someone who's really irritable, really angry. A friend or someone you see that's lost interest in the things that used to excite them. If you had a friend who used to like to play baseball, and he's been having some trouble recently, and one of the things is suddenly he doesn't want to play baseball anymore. Suddenly he doesn't want to do the things that he used to enjoy. That's a real sign of depression. Some other things are difficulty concentrating and a change in eating habits. So the self-esteem is a small part of a bigger problem. And again, having a low self-esteem at times is really typical for being a teenager. Unfortunately, there's no way around that. It's just kind of what happens. I think every adult you talk to probably went through the same thing. Being depressed or having what's called a mood disorder, that's the word for it in my field, is a little bit different.
So low self-esteem and depression are two different things.
Yeah, again, having a low self-esteem is kind of like a small part of a depression, but you can have a low self-esteem and not be clinically depressed.
So how does self-esteem or depression caused? What is a cause of depression?
Well, right now there are a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas what causes it. One thing we're learning more and more as time goes on is that there's a physical component to it. There's an actual part of someone's body that doesn't quite work the way it should, and therefore puts out different moods in the person. There's also different factors that lead into it, like family difficulties, problems in school. It's kind of like a combination of having the physical problem and having some of the other things thrown in. Again, the more and more we learn about it, the more and more we're learning about the actual physical part of it.
What's the difference between a typical teen and a depressed teen?
Again, look for some of the signs like the sleeping, the lack of interest. The lack of interest is very important. A teenager who's having some trouble, like with a typical teenager problem, and I don't mean to say a typical teenager problem, because when I was a teenager, they didn't seem so typical. You know, it all seemed
Mom won't
like,
give me the car.
yeah, that seemed like the end of the world at that time, and that's normal. The difference is a typical teen is going to come out of it, maybe after a couple weeks, or they'll start to get on with their lives. A teen who's depressed or is having a mood disorder is going to stay that way for a while. Sometimes for months and sometimes even for years.
Is depression hereditary?
It can be. Again, the more we're learning about it, and I don't want to sound like a doctor, the best person to talk to on those kind of issues would be a psychiatrist. But the more we learn, the more we know that, yeah, it is hereditary.
Do depressed teens ever take up hobbies?
If they don't, maybe it would be a good idea for them to do it. Hobbies and activities are one thing that we as therapists use to try and build kids' self-esteem and let them see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So I think hobbies or activities are really very good for kids who are in depression, or even for any kid at all. I mean, hobbies are great for anybody.
Yeah. Is it better if they take up hobbies then?
In my opinion?
Yeah.
In my opinion, yeah, I think it is. But then again, sometimes that can be a sign of trouble if someone's too into something. You know, that's their whole life is that hobby,
Yeah.
if there's nothing else outside of that.
Is there any relation to drugs and alcohol?
Yeah, very much so. A good number of people who are drug and alcohol abusers are in fact depressed. To simplify it, it's kind of like the sneeze when you have a cold, or a fever when you have a cold. It's a part of being depressed. And it's probably the most dangerous part of it, or one of the most dangerous parts of it, because you wind up in a lot of trouble from using drugs and alcohol. You wind up being in trouble with the law, trouble with your family. Again, it's probably the worst symptom or sign of depression.
So what are signs of then just low self-esteem?
Feeling kind of down about yourself. There's an old word we used to use in my field called self-efficacy, or efficacy, excuse me. One of the reasons we don't use it anymore is it's so hard to pronounce. But what that meant was your ability to deal with problems. When something would come up, you'd be able to deal with it, you'd be able to handle it. Being a teenager, a lot of these problems, this is the first time you've ever gone through a lot of this stuff, so you don't know if you can deal with it. You might not. The first time you go to a dance, or the first time you have to talk in front of your class, you don't know if you can handle it. So when you're feeling down, again, that's pretty normal, or when you're feeling nervous about it, that's pretty normal. And as far as signs of that go, just how do you feel about doing something? You feel worried about it? You know, do you not feel worried about it? And if you are worried about it, that's okay.
So you're saying you should be confident but not overconfident?
I'm saying you should be confident, but it's impossible to just go into something and say, you know, everybody's going to be nervous about doing things, especially for the first time. I mean, it's just typical.
What can family and friends do to help somebody who is depressed?
The most important thing, I think, would be to be very supportive and to learn about what's happening. The more you learn about it, the more you know about it, the more you're going to understand it and be able to help the person. The more a family learns about a mood disorder or depression, the more when the kid is acting irritable or acting angry, they'll understand that it's not necessarily coming at them, and maybe some of the arguing would slow down. Go get help. There's a lot of people through school counselors, through your ministers, through neighborhood outreach programs that can help you now. In the past 10 years or so, the things we can do for depression, some of the drugs that psychiatrists can use are very, very helpful, and they're starting to work now. Now depression's not something that you're going to have to spend the rest of your life, sitting being depressed all the time. People can help you now, and I think that's very important.
Do people try to hide their depression?
Yeah, and
What are some of the ways they do that?
a lot of ways. And when you think about it, any way of hiding it, staying in your room a lot. That could, the lack of interest and stuff, just kind of getting away from it. I think sometimes using the drugs and alcohol is a way of hiding it. If you're drunk, you might not be feeling so depressed. In the end, you're going to have to pay for being drunk, both your body and for what you do.
Yeah.
But for that time, it might be a way of trying to hide it.
Well, as far as staying in your room, isn't it like just getting away from your parents for a while?
Yeah, and again, it's kind of,
Judgment
some of
call?
that's typical, but when it gets to be a real problem, when you don't want to do things with your friends, when you don't want to go to different things that you used to like or that most kids want to do, or when really all you want to do is stay in your room by yourself, that's probably not the best thing in the world.
Do parents ever come to you and say, my child's depressed, and the child really isn't?
Yeah, sometimes. Part of my job is to help them see what's going on and what the problem is, and go for it. It's like anything else. Sometimes you'll hear about something that's in the news, and depression's been in the news a lot recently. So everybody's depressed. A while ago it was something else, and it was something called attention deficit disorder. Everyone had attention deficit disorder. Now everyone's got a mood disorder. In a couple of years it'll be something new that everybody will have. And that's good because you're learning more about it, but not everybody is depressed. Just because you're a teenager at home and you want to stay in your room for a couple days by yourself, that doesn't mean you're depressed and you need to go see a doctor right away. Some of that's, again, pretty normal.
So parents can cause little problems here and there.
Yeah, and because parents are people too.
They
And
were.
I know it's hard to believe, but your parents were once kids, and
A long time ago.
yeah, and they probably went through some of the same stuff you're going through, and they're probably experiencing some of the same stuff now. They have their own set of things that they need to think about.
Kids a lot of times fear their parents or worry about what they're going to think. Do you have any ways that a parent can talk to their child, or a child can talk to their parent?
That's actually really important, and one of the things that where I work and in my job I do try and help is get communication going between the parents and the kids. A lot of times the parents are probably just as scared of you as you are of them. It's hard for them to talk to you, and it's hard for you to talk to them. One of the advantages I have is I can come in as like a third person and kind of be the neutral party and kind of,
A medium.
yeah, and go in between people. And that's probably one of the most important things in my job. As far as tips to parents, just try and remember when you were a kid and what it was like for you and some of the things that you felt and you had to go through. And then maybe what your son or daughter's doing won't seem so bad to you.
So depression, low self-esteem are different.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And how do you help people who are depressed, and how do you help people who have low self-esteem?
Okay. Well, again, someone who's depressed, it's a pretty safe bet they've got a low self-esteem. It's a real safe bet.
So you work at the bottom?
You kind of start, some of the things I like to do, and different therapists will do it different ways. There's probably books and books and books and books about how to work with depressed kids or how to work on self-esteem. It was real big in the 60s, and it's kind of making a comeback. Some of the better tools are basically teaching the kids they can handle things, finding things, no matter what it is, that you can do. And there's a lot of things out there that everybody's good at, and you just got to kind of point those out to people. One of my favorite tools that we use at our program is something called adventure-based counseling, and we have a group of people who take kids on camping trips even, and that way they go through a lot of different things and figure out that wow, I can do stuff, I can handle stuff. The hobbies I think are great. I like to help kids get in hobbies. I'm a big fan of interscholastic sports. I think they're terrific. That way you get into something and you can be successful at something, or you can work for something. And I think that's really important. So with self-esteem, I just think it's important just to show the kid that, yeah, you can do something and you can do it well. For depression, again, that's a little more involved. It kind of, you need to go see someone about it, a professional, someone who's trained to deal with that. Generally, people will go through a psychiatrist and sometimes get medication for it. And a lot of the medication's been in the news recently. Time magazine even had a cover story about all the new medications, or sorry, it was Newsweek had a cover story about all the new medications for depression. I'm also working with a therapist, and therapists are people too, so we're not all that bad to go see. We talk to a lot of kids about going to see a therapist, and I think they start getting rashes on their arms or something. They want to stay away. But it can be pretty helpful.
What are some ideas for kids out there who are a little afraid or apprehensive about what a therapist's office is like and what it does, so they're not as scared for when?
Well, again, I just remember that therapists are like everybody else. There's going to be ones you like, there's going to be ones you might not like. Generally, we're pretty nice people, or at least I like to think we're pretty nice people. I'm kind of biased, though, when it comes to that. Don't be afraid. We're not going to go around saying to our neighbors, oh, yeah, little Jimmy was in my office yesterday, and this is what all he said. We're not going to do that. Everyone who does this is trained and has gone through a lot to learn how to do this. Generally, therapists are pretty good listeners. If you're not, you probably should find another job, because that's really what you do most of the time, is listen to people. And I just take a shot at it. Don't worry, it's not going to hurt you any. You might. Are you going to go to a therapist and feel better the next day? Probably not. But are you going to go to a therapist and then be able to help you in the long run? Probably so.
How does a friend or family member confront a person who seems depressed? Because you could approach some people and say that, and they may be depressed, but they...
Very carefully. Again, that would really depend a lot on the person. That's one of the hardest things to do, is to sit there and say, I think something's wrong. I think we need to do something about it. Because a lot of times the person doesn't want to hear that, because that's another person telling you something's wrong. And it's hard. I think that's important, is not to let them think that you're bad or there's something wrong with you.
I'd like to bring out some teens to ask you questions. Would that be okay?
Sure.
We brought out our lovely studio audience here. Are there any questions for Mr. Gillie about his profession, depression, self-esteem?
I have one. When you know somebody's depressed, how do you go about getting them to go see a therapist, or telling them about it?
That's really, really, really difficult. It's really hard even for a parent to get a kid to go get help. Most of the time, unfortunately, it comes from some outside agency or some kind of trouble that the kid gets into. They get referred because of something they've done, not necessarily because their parents take them and say, I think you need to go see someone. It's usually because of something they've done in school, or not going to school, having trouble in school, or maybe having difficulty outside of school in the neighborhood. I wish that more kids would be able to come in just off the streets before some of this stuff happens, or more parents were able to get kids to go in before something goes wrong, but unfortunately that's really not the way it always works out. Anybody else?
Apparently the studio audience has no questions.
Well, good.
So your profession is at a school, and you don't like, pick people out and say, I want you and you and you to report. So demanding people to go would be, like, not a good thing to do.
No, that wouldn't work. In my situation, my job, my position's a little bit different in that I work for a school where kids are sent to. So I get to see these kids pretty much every day. That's not the typical therapist, what the typical therapist does. The typical therapist sees the kids once a week or twice a week or once every, however often. And a lot of times the kids or the families don't come or decide that they don't want to. There's no one that can make someone go see a therapist, unless, of course, they've been in trouble with the law, and that's part of what they're required to do. More and more with the legal system, people and kids are being required to go see therapists or required to go to therapy as part of their consequences for what they've done.
When you get the people that you're going to therapize or
work with. That's going to tempt the word, though. I like that.
You have to check their background. Do you also have to check their family's background for hereditary depression or?
Normally, we have a lot of information on death. I mean, we're not like Big Brother, looking at everyone's family background or going back. But we, as therapists, tend to ask a lot of questions about things. And one of the things we look into is, the history of people in the family or the history of what the kids have had to deal with since they've been here, and that is important. But we can't we're not going to go prodding into everybody's life and sit you in an office with a light up above you going, I know
where are we going on the 25th?
That's not the way we do things, and I don't think that would work real well. Don't think people would like working with us after that.
Thank you, Mr. Gillie, for once again coming to YTV, and
thanks for having me.
We'd like to have you back sometime for other things, maybe.
Maybe coffee.
Well, thanks.
This wraps up another edition of YTV. Join us next time.
Don't go away. YTV will be right back. And remember, all Y all the time.
George Kansky